faculty member. My name is Elizabeth Creamer. I'm a faculty member at Virginia Tech, where I've been for 35 years. I'm a professor of educational research. I teach mixed methods and different kinds of educational research methods. I was involved at the Advanced VT project at Virginia Tech between 2003 and 2010, so for almost 7 years, as the director of the assessment and evaluation piece. I was on the leadership team of that project. Since then, I've been involved as the evaluator of 4 different advanced projects. I've done site visits to advanced institutions, and I've helped 3 different institutions develop advanced proposals. One of the things I think that the advanced institutions are challenged to do from the onset is to clearly define their goals and to clearly define what would be their metric for success. Like, for instance, if their goal is hiring, what would they consider a successful investment of 5 years of time in hiring? So part of it is establishing the metrics, even though they may not be that complicated, and then continually measuring progress toward those metrics and communicating that progress. And that's one of the things that I think is really key, is to constantly communicate your progress toward the metrics of success. Well, I mentioned hiring, so let me talk about that as one of the principal goals that many advanced institutions do have, which is to promote the recruitment of and retention of women into STEM fields, into faculty roles in STEM fields. And for most people, that requires diversifying the pool of people they interview. So clearly, it's fairly easy to keep track of the number of finalists that are in a pool for academic positions across, say, a college, and then to compare the gender and racial diversity in the pool and how that changes over time. One of the challenges in advanced grants have been that it's one thing to diversify the pool, and I think advanced institutions have been very successful at that because they've been proactive about recruiting. But the diversifying the pool does not necessarily transfer into a successful hire, in the sense that these women often that we're talking about are so sought after. And often it involves a package, so it doesn't necessarily translate into a hire. So in that case, the best way to measure is the pool, and know that progress is made when a pool is more diverse. And then years later, you're going to begin to see more significant increases in the number of people expecting a hire. In our own institution, at the advanced grant, a context issue that's shared by many institutions is severe competition for resources, particularly among the colleges and units that are not in the College of Engineering. I happen to come from an institution where there is one premier college, the College of Engineering, and everyone else is sort of in the pool to compete, and there is this tremendous sense of a tightness of resources, and that it's a small pie, and that if you give part of the pie to advance, then you're giving less of a pie to someone else. So the competition, the sense of competition for resources, the sense that it's taking resources from other colleges, the sense that it's taking resources from diversity issues, was a context issue that I think was very dominant. One of the things that most surprised me at my own institution was how affected applicants were by the information that was on the web page about the institution being family friendly. And they seemed to really be looking for very overt statements about the institution as being welcoming of families, welcoming of diversity. That seemed to play a very strong role in attracting people to even apply for the positions, that they seemed to be very careful and alert to clues relating particularly to spousal hires is another area where the family-friendly really overlaps. People would constantly ask me, how will you know if you're successful? How will you know you were successful? Now, I happened at the time to be collaborating with someone who had been in administration a long time, and her asking me that question was very helpful. At the end, she said, tell me how you know you succeeded. You know, the grant is over. Tell me how you know you succeeded. And this led me to think that it's not only important, it's very important that the team not only be clear about what they consider a measure of success, but that they constantly communicate that measure and they communicate their progress toward that measure. So when I answered the question for that colleague of mine, which I felt I did, on numerous occasions, I pointed to things like, for instance, for our institution, I think the biggest outcome was policy change. So we had a number of very significant policy changes that are still in effect now. So that also addresses the sustainability issues. Policy change in this case meant, first of all, we had this wonderful proactive provost. And amazingly as it was, the tenure and promotion guidelines were not documented in many departments. So one of the first things that happened under Advance was the insistence that all departments develop written policies and that those policies be shared. And now there is much more documentation about the policies than there ever was, and this is probably 2005 by then, prior to 2005. And the reason that's important is because people who are not on the insides are the one least likely to know the policies, and the one most likely to need the written policies. The people on the inside know the policies. The ones who have the mentors, they know the policies, but the people who are not so close to the top don't necessarily know the policy, particularly the sort of informal policies. So one of our policy changes was about P&T, was about documenting P&T. The second one, I think, also has had very lasting influences, and both of these are done now in almost all advanced institutions. And that was the creation of stop the clock, or also what is known as modified duties policies, which allow both men and women to take, to essentially add a year to their tenure clock, due sometimes to issues of birth or adoption, or to other issues like family health. I think the surprising thing about that is that it's had the unintended consequence of pretty much extending the tenure clock for many people from what was 6 years to more like 7 years. It's more traditional, it's more common. There were tremendous fears that women would be penalized for taking 7 years to go up for tenure, that it would sort of have a backlash. But instead, at my institution, what it does is normalize the possibility of 7 years to go up for tenure, which, considering that for most young faculty members, those are their only childbearing years, that is when they have a chance to raise a family. So I honestly believe that if they looked at my own institution, they would see that there is a larger number of faculty who have had children during their pre-tenure years as a result of some of these policy changes. So when I talk to that woman, one of the things I would point to is policy change is the main and lasting effect of the program. In my own institution, it wasn't the team that was the most visible part of the grant. It was the top-level leaders who, interestingly, were all men. So one of the things advanced grants required after the first round or two was provost-level involvement, academic vice president-level involvement, and dean commitment. Those are the people who really became the principal spokespersons for our grant. And that's really a very positive thing because they really took it on as an agenda that meant a lot to them, and they spoke a lot about it.